So what tests, going off of the evaluation stuff, like what tests are important to you to determine, you talked about spine, you talked about hips, like to tell you which position they're in or which way they're facing or um, which way one ilium is facing versus the other versus the neck. Like, do you deal with the neck much at all? But basically, I guess you do a superficial, like you check the superficial structures. Now, how do you tell where the actual skeleton is?
I think one thing is think about what pattern they move in the most, specifically during their sport. Am I glitchy a little bit right now or no? Am I
A little
good?
bit, a little bit of robotic.
So what position are they in most frequently as far as like if they're a pitcher, maybe one hip is easier to get into than the other, or just thinking again functionally or just the most repeated thing that's most likely to put them into that position. So that's one consideration that I would think of, and that's not going to bias me, but it's definitely good context for why might their joint be in that position. Another thing too is we can't rely on passive motion. So if I have them supine and I bring one leg up and bring them into hip ER and IR, just because the hip wants to move one way or the other, doesn't mean that that's a joint block always. Um, so I want to see some dynamic movement. Like, can they hip shift? Can they physically, like, abduct, internally rotate, externally rotate, and from different positions? I'm not just taking them in a seated ERIR and then saying, okay, this is all you can do, because muscular positions change. A piriformis can turn into an internal rotator if you change the hip position. So you have to take a lot of things into account. So I think those are two kind of big things. And I would honestly maybe value that a little more than saying, what is the resting position that the hip is in? It's like, dynamically, what position can the hip get into, or whatever joint we're talking about. But I don't know. I feel like hip is a quite popular one.
So I think range of motion can tell us basically we're able to move. So that's another thing I start thinking about recently is like you can move into areas. It kind of clicked for me today a little bit. I was thinking about it on the drive home. I was like, oh, it just started making more sense. So you move through areas of eccentric. And so if muscle can be biased towards a concentric or eccentric, basically it can be one or the other. And what got me thinking about is a couple of strength coaches today were talking about this dude who squats, and every time he squats, he gets down, and then he always shifts into his right, always shifts into his right. And I was trying to think a little more. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's probably a ton of other things that are probably it too. Like training age, and he's been in quarantine for the past month and a half, and so it's kind of like just getting back. I mean, he's back squatting, so probably wasn't the best exercise for him. So they can do some other things for that. But for him, that tells me that at least that right hip capsule or muscles surrounding the hip capsule or the glute, something there is a little more eccentrically oriented. And so that's what got him shifting into there. Maybe that left side was just like overcoming, and it was concentric, and it was pushing him over to that side. And so he couldn't get into it. And so I think it's definitely powerful to see movement happen. Like you said about basically someone on the table is going to be, it's a snapshot. Like what position are they in right now on the table? It's not really overall what they're using when they're moving around. And so that was like for me, that was kind of cool to think about. Okay, like if this is how he moves in the field on the table, I can think about that if I do an evaluation on him. But for me right now, I like using, or I'm going through a book right now, Thorax by Diane Lee, and I haven't really played around with it too much, but you can basically poke on the sternum and sternum manubrium and find like if one side's higher than the other, not tell you at least which way the sternum or the manubrium is facing, part of it. But as well as I'll confirm with IR, glenohumeral IR, and abduction. And so if like they have more IR and abduction on their left, um, and then less on the right, and I mean, could be also part of like that's their sport, that's what they do. So maybe they had to adapt a little more, but I'm going to assume they're more rotated that way if they can clear more abduction and clear more internal rotation on the other side compared to the other side. And so I think about that ahead. At least, okay, maybe at least that's just the way the sternum or the upper body is spaced, and then I'll do like a just a typical like trunk tilt and just kind of see which way they're going. Like today, I went on one of the athletic trainers and he had way more to his left. So I'm assuming okay, his upper body essentially is rotated to his left, and then his hips always they get me a little tricky because I don't want to say oh he's got good motion on it, he got good external motion on his left, external rotation on his left, and less IR, but more IR on his right on his left. So he's probably facing whatever. And um, like you said, I think that's just a snapshot. So I don't think like dynamically like that's exactly where he is. And for me, it's hard to tell exactly where someone is in space. Um, so I'm always a little uncomfortable other than just like, hey, stand up. Which way is your zipper face? And so maybe like that's just a little more accurate or a little more just easier to test. Um, then you're looking at pieces all day if you say that. But maybe you can do the same thing. Like we can test like an adduction, see if one side drops or one side doesn't drop on adduction, and abduction too. I'm using that a little more now. So like I checked the dude's abduction on his left side, basically had none, and his right side had way more. And so to me, that told me okay, maybe he is, maybe he is facing, or at least that right ilium is a little more internally rotated, or maybe just he just has concentric action in his hips, and maybe it's um, it's not. But it was it's hard. Like I think that's where some of my process is kind of messed up. Is I can't tell for like I can't 100% say oh your hips are or your sacrum is definitely facing left or definitely facing right. Um, I don't know if it matters. I think if like you still have a sagittal plane issue, like that's I'm not going to be every two. I'm not going to be shifting right away or doing things that are like okay, we need to get left, we need to get right. So I think of like bilaterals super important, and that's where you can definitely tell that. Like you can tell okay, does a guy lack hip flexion? Does a guy lack hip flexion, straight leg, hip flexion, knee bent? Then you can see which way, like how much motion do they have, and can they touch the ground? And you think just simple that, like bent over. So if you look at them sideways, how does their do the all three segments? Does it flex or does it stay straight? Like you saw a picture of my back. It's basically a low back is just bored, and then it bends and bends, and so it's kind of like, well, I can't move through here, and so that'll tell you have you know, like we talked about before, if it's concentric, you can't move through it. So I can't move through all in the hips. I can't move through my lumbopelvic region very well. So maybe I should take up twerking or something to get that going. I don't know, but
Looking for an excuse to twerk.
yeah. Um, so maybe that's why people hula hoop. I just thought about it. Um, I heard about people like, oh, I broke my hand, so next thing you know, they're hula hooping um, with the team, not to be named,
Just to bring it around town.
just to bring around town. But
Part of
um,
it's probably too like how nitpicky do you want to be? It's like, he's got 5 more degrees on this side than the other side. It's like maybe that's important, but then again, it's like once you see, like you said, with that one guy where it's like one side is nothing, the other is he's going for days.
yeah,
Maybe that's something that you pay a little more attention to versus, hey,
yeah,
he's barely making it on this side and then he makes it on this side or whatever. So